We have reached a watershed moment in the book of Exodus with what we saw last week in the parting of the Red Sea. Up until that point, everything is about God saving the Israelites from their slavery in Egypt and freeing them. From this point forward, everything is going to be about their relationship with Him, building that up, understanding what it means to have been redeemed by Him, and understanding His process of refining them. That's the rest of what we find in Exodus, and the Israelites do not get off to a good start. That's what we're going to be seeing today, is their complaining in the wilderness, that they are ungrateful for what God has done for them, and that comes from their distrustfulness. That they don't believe that He's going to do what is right, what is necessary, but God gives what is necessary. That's all that He gives. He does not fail to provide, and He also will not fail to bring defiance to task. So we need to understand that from their example, to learn to do what they did not, that we have to offer gratitude instead of complaints. And we find this in Exodus chapter 15. If you have a Bible, you want to open it up to Exodus 15 if you've not already done so, or electronic device if you're using that. The hotel's Wi-Fi is available if you need to search for that online. Their information is on the handouts that you have. Exodus chapter 15, starting with verse 22. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea. Then they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Now when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah, which means bitter. And the people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. And when he cast it into the waters were made sweet. There he made a statute and an ordinance for them, and there he tested them, and said, "If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in His sight, give ear to His commandments, and keep all His statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, so they camped there by the waters. To start out here, we should understand this is an understandable concern. You don't have any water in the desert, that's a problem. So yes, for them to be worried about it, we can get that. What is not appropriate here is their attitude about it. And it's totally unaccountable. It's really difficult, I think, to understand how they can behave this way because of what's right in front of them. We talked last week about the form of guidance that they received in the form of the pillar of cloud, and how we also receive guidance because we have God's word with us, and believers have God's Spirit within us. But humans are very much visual creatures, and we like those phenomena that we can see, something that's physically manifest, and the Israelites had that. And they are just very shortly removed from having passed through the Red Sea on dry ground. But here they are, they're still grumbling. And their grumbling is really thinly veiled, because they aim it at Moses. They complain to him. Why are you doing this to us? But he's just following God, so they're really complaining about God, saying that He is not leading them well. And it raises an important point for us, even for people today, is that miracles, they don't produce faith. You will hear people who don't believe in God who occasionally say, well, if God wants me to believe in Him, then He just needs to show me something. Well, that wouldn't make a difference to them, even if He did, because their hearts aren't in the right place. And when the heart is in the right place, it doesn't need the miracle either, because God's already done enough to see to be responded to, particularly in the miracle that matters most, in the resurrection. But for anything and everything, it really is about the attitude, that is where it matters most, for the heart to be set on following God rather than your own desires. They weren't doing that. And so even with all the miracles that they saw, it wasn't making a difference actually in their lives. But God continues to provide, and actually does so through another miracle here, through the whatever filtration or whatever it was that He did with this tree. By just throwing it into waters that were not potable beforehand, suddenly they could drink them, and they were provided for there. But along with that, He starts to create the idea for them, the understanding that He's not just going to be giving them everything without any type of qualification. That there is going to be a process of testing involved for them. That's the reason He led them out into the desert, was in order to train them. that they would need to learn to trust and to obey, and that they would have to obey in order to avoid judgment. It's tied into what happened to Egypt, that the diseases, the plagues that they had suffered were as a result of being punished for what they had done against God. The Israelites needed to avoid that same thing happening by obeying him. Now, that didn't mean that they would never suffer. There are a lot of different causes for suffering in the world. For one thing, the world is just broken because of sin in general, because of Adam and Eve and everything that has followed on from there. And we can suffer because of those things. Then we can also suffer because of what other people do to us, like the Egyptians had done to the Israelites. That was not the Israelites' fault. But the ultimate and greatest form of suffering is suffering that comes in judgment from God for the things that we do against him. And the only way to avoid that punishment is to obey him, to do what he says, to understand that his justice is sure. It is coming. We want to be on the right side of it by listening to him. And so that's what the Israelites here, he was saying, I'm going to be teaching you this. He's still teaching us this today. But the Israelites' response to this situation is to just get bolder in their ingratitude. So we find in chapter 16, verse 1. They journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Then Moses and Aaron said to all the children of Israel, At evening you shall know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your complaints against the Lord. What are we that you complain against us? Also Moses said, This shall be seen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and in the morning bread to the full. For the Lord hears your complaints which you make against him. And what are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord. The Israelites apparently were encouraged by their previous success, as they viewed it. They'd complained about not having water, so God gave them water. So they figured, well, now we'll complain about not having food that we want and that we need, and so he'll just have to give us that too. And they make this complaint, first of all, by applying a rose-colored lens to their memories of Egypt, looking back on where they had just come from, where they were enslaved, and saying, we were better off there, because at least we had food all the time. And then this hyperbolic accusation, we had food there, you want to kill us. That's the only explanation for why you could have brought us out here, is you want us to die. This is your fault. And again, saying it to Moses, but really saying it to God, what have you done for us lately? That's their approach to him. Their understanding of him is that he should constantly have to give them, immediately respond to whatever it is that they want. God, once again, in his graciousness, he does provide. He says, yes, I am, of course, going to feed you. But he establishes a commandment along with that feeding. Their first regular one that they're going to have to follow every day. Because they've had a few others along the way, especially with the Passover, but that's going to be once a year. Every day they are going to go out and they are going to get this bread that's called manna, which basically just means, what is this stuff? Because it was a flake that was on the ground after the dew disappeared, and they could gather it and they could make that into cakes and into bread, and so it was provided for them miraculously. But they were only supposed to take as much as they needed every day, except for on Fridays, when they were supposed to take twice as much as that, so that they would not take any on Saturdays. And so that's what God said. This is the rule for you. You follow this in order to show that you are capable of actually listening to my voice. And Moses is going to explain this to them, and he also says, I think he's being kind of sarcastic here when he says, you're going to know that the Lord was the one who let you out of Egypt. They already know that, or should already know that. He's basically saying, oh yeah, I guess it's a mystery how we got this far, but now you're going to know because he's going to feed you. And they shouldn't have forgotten that already, but that's where their hearts are, is they want everything immediately as they want it. And so he tells them, yeah, he is going to provide, but you're not fooling anybody. You're complaining about us, about me and Aaron. You're really complaining about God. He knows that. And as I say here often, God's not going to be their genie. He's not just there to grant their wishes. He doesn't exist for their sake. They exist for his pleasure. It's a lesson that they have to learn, to actually trust him, not just demand from him. But they just keep doing this, disobeying God because they don't trust him. And that's what happens in their response to being given the manna. We find that in verse 19. Moses said, "Let no one leave any of it till morning." Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses. But some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. So they gathered it every morning, every man according to his need. And when the sun became hot, it melted. And so it was on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning." So they laid it up till morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. Then Moses said, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none." Now it happened that some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, for the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you on the 6th day bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. They make an error on both sides of this. Go to both extremes on God's commands concerning the collection of the manna through the week. But first of all, they refused to believe, to trust, that God would give them enough every day. And so that was why they took more than they needed. That, well, yeah, it was there this morning, but it might not be there tomorrow, so we better take some extra, just in case. Which sounds reasonable enough until they should have taken into account God said, "I'm going to provide for you every day, so you don't need to do this." And then it just went to rot, because God was not going to allow them to keep that and to disobey him that way. They get through that point. They realize, all right, yeah, it's going to be there every morning. But then when Friday comes around, and that's the day that they are supposed to take the extra and are actually told to, well, then they don't believe that it's going to last. They figure, well, it's always rotted if we kept any extra, so surely that's what's going to happen again, so we better be ready to just go out on Saturday to get it too. And so they went out to work when they were told not to, and found nothing, and may very well those who did so went hungry because they had not collected twice as much the day before. It's just nothing to show for it, except for the anger of Moses and the anger of God. Moses, who is frustrated with their stubbornness, and God, who is frustrated with their disobedience, and that they refuse to understand that what he says goes. It's not what they believe. They believe that they should be in charge. That's why they continue, once more for today, to defy him, which we find in chapter 17, verse 1. All the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped in Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." So Moses said to them, "Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord?" And the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why is it that you have brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Go on before the people, and take with you some of the elders of Israel. Also take in your hand your rod with which you struck the river, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the contention of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Again, the pillar of cloud. These are people who are moving at God's command, moving at his direction. He has this in front of them to guide them, but they're still not satisfied that he's with them. And they continue to make these demands. And they continue to exaggerate the dangers and what possible reason God could have for bringing them out here. And they doubt his presence, which is absurd because he's right there in front of them. But it's because of what they ultimately wanted. When we see their complaints and the fact that they've been brought out of Egypt is apparently a problem to them, it's not really because they wanted to go back and be slaves. It's because as far as they were concerned, God should have given them Egypt. That if he could overthrow them the way that he did, then it should have been no problem to just make them the ruling people group in Egypt and put all the Egyptians under them so that they could have the most powerful empire on earth. Why was he bothering to take them away from the place that they had known for so long and to make them go through hard times out in the desert? It's ridiculous. That's their attitude, is that they think they should have everything their way. That's why they are defying God. And that's why they're complaining at every turn that they can. Because they do not want to believe that God knows better than they do. And Moses, his frustration is just at its height here. He's sick of their complaints. He's afraid of their blasphemy, because that's what it amounts to. And he's annoyed at their threats, that they're apparently talking about killing him. And so he too cries out, but he cries out the right way, to the Lord. Lord, I can't do this on my own. What am I supposed to do? Please help me, give me the strength to deal with this. And so God does by once again providing for them, but not immediately. He has them finish their journey to go to Mount Sinai, which is where he's sending them. That's another, Horeb is another name for that region where that was. And he sends them on their own. It's not mentioned now that the pillar of cloud guides them there. It says that Moses does that he is the one who leads the people, which he was capable of doing because he had been there. This was the area where he had met with God at the burning bush. But it is, in essence, God saying, if you are going to defy me, I am not going to be with you. That's the danger that they are running themselves into here. Until eventually they do approach him, and it probably was the cloud again that appeared over this rock, and so Moses knew that that was the one to hit. And by hitting it, he was symbolizing the Israelites' abuse of him, trying to take advantage of God and what God was putting up with in order to provide for them, and in order to continue to prove, even in spite of their behavior, that he was still their Savior, and that they needed to come to him for life. And so Moses names it Massah and Meribah, temptation and contention, because they're going to be here for a while. This is where God is going to give them their law, is going to create his covenant with them. And so they're going to get their water every day from this place. That's going to be a constant reminder of their unfaithfulness and their ingratitude, so that maybe they can learn from it that this is not the attitude that they should take. They should instead see what God has done for them and live for him out of thankfulness for that, which is what we need to do as well. That there are connections that we need to be able to draw out of this for ourselves in the day of Christianity. First of all, where it concerns the Sabbath, we don't have that. We'll talk about this more when we get into the Ten Commandments as well. But we don't have this day that's necessarily set aside where we're commanded to do no work. Jesus basically did away with this in Mark chapter 2, where he talks about how the Sabbath was created for man and not man for the Sabbath. It was meant to be a gift. It was supposed to be for us, and instead it became a burden. As it became a matter of the law, it became an obligation. And so it was something that's not included in what we have to do, but it is still an attitude that we should want to have. Because really what the Sabbath was for faithfulness and reliance. That we do not have to be constantly running around like chickens with our heads cut off. That if we stop working and being busy and trying to be productive, that the world's not going to stop spinning as a result of that. It doesn't depend on us. It depends on God. And so when we can just stop and rest in Him, then we learn more to trust in Him for everything else that we have to do. So that is the attitude that we should take. And in trying to obey God, to not go outside of His commands because we think, well, it seems reasonable enough to us. If it's what He said, then it's where we have to go. And then when it comes to the manna, there's a really important connection to this for us as well. Because the manna represented, it was called bread from heaven. And this is meant to be a contrast with what the Israelites had had to do for so many years that they had been slaves, that they had had to work for their bread. They were under that forced labor. But it goes back even further than that. It goes to Adam in the Garden of Eden, how when he sinned in Genesis chapter 3 and they were cast out of paradise, that one of the things he was told was that he was going to be cursed by having to earn his bread by the sweat of his brow, that he was going to have to toil rather than just being given things directly by God. The manna turns that around. It is given directly by God, but it's still just symbolic. It was only life for the body. It had to be eaten every day. It was only pointing to the true bread from heaven, which is what Jesus calls himself in John chapter 6. That the people who ate the manna in the wilderness died. Eventually that power ran out. But those who are sustained by Christ always live. Because his body that was given as a sacrifice is what provides the life for the spirit. And he's also present in the rock. That's pointing to him as well. That he, too, was contended with by his people. And then he was struck. And by being stricken, he poured out his life, and that provided life for everyone that comes to him. But they have to actually come to him instead of continuing to fight. Rebellion, unfortunately, is going to become a key theme of Exodus, and really, essentially, the remainder of the Old Testament. That's their relationship, and it's the risk that we still run today. It's why the author of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 3, verses 13 through 19, says, "Exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. While it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. For who, having heard, rebelled? Indeed, was it not all who came out of Egypt led by Moses? Now with whom was he angry 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who did not obey? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief." Everything that the Israelites did showed how ungrateful they were. Their ingratitude came from a lack of faith. That ultimately, it wasn't about believing that God existed. It was about not believing that God gave them everything that they needed. And so because of that, they were constantly turning against him and doing what he said not to, and not doing what he said to. And it just was going to lead them to disaster. It still leads to disaster. We have to take the chances that God gives us to obey. We have to tell others to do the same. We have to continually be told, not to defy God. Where that is ultimately most important is depending on God for salvation. And so that's why we always finish sermons here with that invitation to turn to Christ, to see, for anyone who has not done so yet, that God is trying to refine you, to make you into what he wants you to be, which is the best thing that you can be. So you can't make demands of him and contend with him and expect that your complaints are going to result in you getting your way. That is not going to happen. The only way to get what is truly best, to be able to have life that lasts forever, joy that lasts forever, is to accept what Christ has done for you, to trust in him for the forgiveness of sins. Something that you do not have to work for, you just have to take. And I hope that anyone who's not done that before on hearing this will do so today. But for those of us who have done that, we have to take the same message. We know what we have forever, so we should actually live out of it. We should be grateful for what God has done. And we should be patient because of what he's done. Life is going to throw things at us that we are not going to enjoy. They're not going to be going our way. That is part of life. We need to believe that God has it under control, and because of that, we need to be faithful to him. Having faith in him, but being faithful to him by obeying him, by taking seriously what he says, doing things his way. That's true of everything that he's commanded in Scripture, but I think it's especially important when it comes to understanding that we are all on mission. That it's not about being a professional preacher or teacher or evangelist, that each one of us has a responsibility to share what we know, to point others to the bread from heaven, to the water that's been poured out for our life, that we need to show Christ to others so that they too can be free, because he's the only one that can give it to anyone.